Hi, everyone. That was a lovely transition because I'm going to be talking about adaptations of literature into musicals. Wow. Welcome. I'm Anna. Let me I will be talking about applications of critical race theory and decolonization theory to two performances of Moby-Dick. And before I get started, I do want to shout out Mary Battenfeld, my professor, advisor, mentor, wonderful human, who has truly done everything for me. So thank you. All right, getting into it. So most of you might not have read Moby-Dick. You've definitely heard about it. Here is my copy. It's all tabbed up. You probably know that it's about a whale. You might think of it as the great American novel, which is what most people do. And I'm here to interrogate why we think that way and how we can start changing thinking that way. So it kind of started, this idea of the great American novel started post-World War I when America was trying to build their own literary canon. And so scholar F.O. Mathiasen looked back at Moby-Dick, which was a huge failure when it was published. Everyone hated it. Herman Melville died thinking it was his greatest failure. Who wrote, "Melville's hopes for American democracy and his depth of compassion for courageous struggle unite in giving fervor to the declaration of his purpose." So everyone latched onto this and thought democracy, democracy, democracy. And while that is in there, it's also about incredibly important themes like race and colonization, indigeneity, and those all got kind of pushed to the wayside when America was defining what Moby-Dick is. So, moving into our first adaptation, this is a performance of Moby-Dick from 2001 at Juno's Perseverance Theater. And what this was a community collaborative effort to rethink Moby-Dick through an Indigenous-focused lens. It was really important. I unfortunately didn't get to see a presentation of it. I emailed them, but they did not have 2001. They did not have it recorded. But you can see just from the cover here how different it is in thinking about how we're framing this novel. So I want to talk a little bit about it in the lens of decolonization theory. This is another performance. If you're not familiar with decolonization theory, Linda Tuhiwai Smith defines it as why we do what we do, either as researchers and/or activists, to questions about the potential ways in which Indigenous activists and Indigenous researchers can collaborate to advance Indigenous interests at a local, national, and international levels. So what Tuhiwai Smith and also Tuck and Yang, who wrote Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, are really pointing to is the active practice of decolonization, which this Perseverance Theater adaptation really looks to do in making sure that Indigenous voices were at the center of it. It's not credited with one specific playwright or anything because it was truly a community effort, which is, I think, the incredible part about it. One of the main actors, Andrew McLean, it's not exactly, he doesn't translate into a certain character because they all kind of played different roles at different points, but he was on the phone, they said, daily talking to community elders, to his parents, making sure they had Indigenous voices at every stage, and it looked like a wonderful performance, so clearly encapsulating what Tuhiwai Smith points to. Next, we're going to move to the American Repertory Theater's 2019 production. I have the little pin from it. It's the whale. You can even kind of see from this that it's more like that cover that we looked at in the beginning. So think about that as we move forward. And I will be talking about this performance through the lens of critical race theory, two concepts in particular, interest convergence and ignored or alternative realities. So I want to start with the concept of interest convergence, which was developed by Derek Bell in relation to American law theory. As we know, critical race theory is based in law, but it is applicable outside of law as well. So what Bell posited in interest convergence is the idea that civil rights gains were not made in the interest of Black Americans, but in the convenient interest of it was better for white America and the image to do that, so they did that, as opposed to making sincere gains towards equal rights. So when we look at this, we're kind of thinking about, are these race-centric adaptations earnest efforts to kind of like change the landscape of Broadway, like Martin was talking about, or does it fall more into the realm of this was convenient for the theater at this opportune moment for them to have a diverse cast, for them to pitch Moby-Dick? It's definitely something I explored, and it's an important issue to look at. But I do also want to point out the positives to this production, even though it's kind of had more of the traditional hierarchical structure that the Perseverance Theater did not have. It still offered insight into ignored or alternative realities, which Delgado and Stefancic of critical race theory define as well-told stories describing the reality of Black and brown life can help readers to bridge the gap between their worlds and those of others. Engaging stories can help us understand what life is like for others and invite the reader into a new and unfamiliar world. So obviously that's very important in this adaptation because it did allow for incredibly diverse bodies to be on stage in the production process. If you are not familiar with it, it was in Boston, so hopefully some of you guys got to see it. It was at the American Rep. But basically, is that my little pointer? I don't know where the pointer is. There. This is our Ahab figure, and he was actually the only figure who was cast as white in the show and in all future productions. That's in his casting. And the rest of it asks for specifically diverse actors. This obviously depends with Queequeg. They specifically ask for Indigenous actors, which is very important because Queequeg is Indigenous. He is Polynesian in Moby-Dick, and that often gets left out. In the 1956 production, they wanted to keep that he wasn't from America, but they didn't want to deal with indigeneity, so they made him Australian, unfortunately. So we are still grappling with this in past adaptations, so they're really particular about who they want on stage, who they want representing these figures. So this is our Starbuck in that production. And it's really wonderful to just see and visualize what is going on and how we're translating Moby-Dick into a current moment, because it is super relevant. Again, like I had all these tabs, but you can just read it without doing that. Yeah, and that is my slides. Thank you so much.
All right, any questions?
Thank you, Anna. That was awesome. And the whole project was really hard and complicated. I mean, all research is hard, and kudos to everybody else on your project. But interdisciplinary research of the type you're doing is like hard on steroids. I feel like you're looking at Moby-Dick and the critical reception of that. You're looking at theater history, and then you're looking at these two big theoretical categories of decolonization and critical race theory. So, and again, there's a lot of ways I think we could talk about the challenges of that, but could you identify a reward of doing that kind of complicated interdisciplinary research?
Well, first of all, it helped very much to have the class. I did this in my American Studies capstone, which was wonderful to have our little cohort to work with, and to have your amazing guidance with that. But I think the most rewarding thing is just thinking about how the practical ramifications of literature and theater kind of combine, because I'm an English student. I tend to engage with these texts all of the time, but seeing it in person and then turning that into a work that I was really proud of and that I was able to say, I saw this production of Moby-Dick, what can I do with it? And turning it into something where I looked at the positives, the negatives, put it in conversation with another adaptation. It was just a very fun project.
Great job. Really interesting. I learned a lot about Moby-Dick that I didn't know before. One question, it might be super loaded question, is, I'm sorry in advance. You pointed out the benefits and more of the pros and the cons of each production. If there was another production, 2023, Moby-Dick, maybe musical theater, what things maybe would you add, remove, that you think would be the most the best version, the most accurately presented, and maybe for the modern day, for the 2023 problems of today? You can answer one bit of that. I'm so
No, that's
sorry.
very important. Thank you. And it is especially important because I don't know when, but I do know that the American Rep Theater has plans to eventually move forward. So what I would like to see is perhaps a combination, because I think the American Rep Theater is doing well with sticking to the plot of the novel, making the novel accessible, making sure people can see it in real time. It was initially a 6.5-hour musical, and the producers went to the man who wrote it and said, "Hey, buddy, no one wants to see that." So he cut it down to 3 hours and 15 minutes, which is still kind of wacky, but definitely not 6 hours. But I think that was besides the point. What I think I would like to see is perhaps a little bit more of that community focus that we saw in the Perseverance theaters, because again, with that one, like, you can't list a name to the production. For the American Rep Theater, we can say Dave Malloy wrote this based on Herman Melville's novel, but the Perseverance Theater really just took Moby-Dick as the loose, like, way to shape it, and then really let the community like get their hands into it and grapple with the issues, present it in the way they wanted to. And like I said, they weren't representing one specific figure, so it wasn't like, I'm Ishmael, I'm Ahab. Like, it was more of a community even in its presentation. So I think maybe having more diverse voices in the creation as opposed to just being on the stage, because that doesn't really solve the issues that are inherent to Broadway and to theater spaces. So. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I have two questions. The first is, did you happen to see there was a production at the Shed in New York City last year? I think within the last couple of years, which maybe gets at the what would this look like in 2022, 2023 question. That might be something to look into. There was a live orchestra, but the production is otherwise filmed, but it's filmed very much as if it's being staged.
Oh, interesting.
The scholar Fred Moten is like integrated into the script. It's really fascinating. Then my other question is, you mentioned narrative when you had the slide with the Stefancic and Delgado quotation. I wonder if you think there are any elements of Moby-Dick outside of the narrative ones that you would want to think through, kind of imagining what it would look like staged, or thinking through whether critical race theory brings anything to those non-narrative elements of the book, since there's so many kind of genres smushed into Moby-Dick.
Yeah. First of all, I did not know about that other production. That's wonderful. I'm going to check that out. And second of all, I think that's a really interesting question, because so many times when we are engaging with literature, narrative is the only thing on our minds. So we're thinking about like what physically happens in the story. But there are, like you said, Moby-Dick is hard to define. For those of you who might have not read it, the middle of the book entirely, the narrator says, "I'm tired of this, I'm disappearing," and you just get whale facts, like facts about the animal for 70 pages. So it kind of is hard to define in a single category. I think what I would want to see is some of that, I think, leaning into that non-traditional kind of what is going on in this book, because like F.O. Mathiasson kind of ingrained it in the American canon as this representative of America as the democracy. But there are so many interesting things going on, and I think really like leaning into the fact that we have no idea at some points what's happening in this novel, but we're here for the ride, and like we want to go through the journey with it. And I think that would be interesting to explore in light of, you know, maybe things that don't typically get spoken about on Broadway, so race, gender. There was also a heavy emphasis on gender in the American Reps production. So kind of just leaning into, we're doing something that's not expected, just like Moby-Dick did something that's not expected, and perhaps that can help change things. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.